Now they were all witnesses to his wedding, witnesses to my absence. The irony cut deep. These people knew about the most important day of my son's life, but I, his father, had been left in the dark. Some of them probably wondered where I was. Maybe they asked Michael about me. Maybe he had an answer prepared, some story about why his own father couldn't make it to his wedding. Or maybe they didn't ask at all. Maybe my absence was so expected, so normal by now, that nobody even noticed. I tried calling him. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hey, this is Mike. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." Mike, not Michael anymore. When had that changed? I hung up without leaving a message. What was I supposed to say? Congratulations on the wedding I found out about through social media. Thanks for not telling your own father that you were planning the biggest day of your life. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. He'd seen the missed call and declined it. The 3rd time, I didn't even bother listening to his message. I just sat there in my kitchen, phone in my hand, staring at the wedding photos on my laptop screen. My son looked so much older in these pictures than I remembered. When had he gotten those lines around his eyes? When had his hairline started receding just slightly at the temples? When had he stopped being the boy who used to call me Dad and started being this stranger who went by Mike? The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't some mistake where the invitation got lost in the mail or an oversight where someone forgot to call me. This was intentional, deliberate. My son had made a conscious choice to get married without me there. I sat in my empty house, the same house where I'd raised him, where he'd taken his first steps in the living room and learned to read at the kitchen table. And I understood that somewhere along the way, I had become a stranger to my own child. The photos were still there on the screen, hundreds of them, documenting a day that should have been one of the happiest of my life. Instead, they were evidence of how completely I'd been cut out of his world. I could see in his face that he wasn't thinking about me at all. He wasn't sad that I wasn't there. He wasn't missing me. He was relieved. That's what hurt the most. Not that I'd missed his wedding, but that my absence had made his day better. That his happiness was somehow dependent on my not being there to witness it. I closed the laptop, but the images were burned into my memory. My son, smiling wider than I'd seen him smile in years, surrounded by everyone except the man who'd loved him first and longest. The man who'd changed his diapers and taught him to throw a baseball and sat up all night when he had pneumonia at age 7. The man who apparently was no longer welcome in his life. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those wedding photos. Michael in his tuxedo, looking so confident and grown up. Sarah in her white dress, beautiful and radiant. All those familiar faces celebrating without me. So I did what any father would do when his world suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. I tried to figure out where it all went wrong. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, mentally rewinding through the last few years like an old VHS tape, looking for the moment when everything changed. When did my son stop wanting me in his life? The visits had become less frequent, that was true. Used to be, Michael would come by every couple of weeks. We'd watch the game, order pizza, talk about work and life and whatever was on his mind. Simple stuff, father and son time. But gradually those visits stretched out, every thrown. Weeks became once a month. Once a month became every 6 weeks. Now they were all witnesses to his wedding, witnesses to my absence. The irony cut deep. These people knew about the most important day of my son's life, but I, his father, had been left in the dark. Some of them probably wondered where I was. Maybe they asked Michael about me. Maybe he had an answer prepared, some story about why his own father couldn't make it to his wedding. Or maybe they didn't ask at all. Maybe my absence was so expected, so normal by now, that nobody even noticed. I tried calling him. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hey, this is Mike. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." Mike, not Michael anymore. When had that changed? I hung up without leaving a message. What was I supposed to say? Congratulations on the wedding I found out about through social media. Thanks for not telling your own father that you were planning the biggest day of your life. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. He'd seen the missed call and declined it. The 3rd time, I didn't even bother listening to his message. I just sat there in my kitchen, phone in my hand, staring at the wedding photos on my laptop screen. My son looked so much older in these pictures than I remembered. When had he gotten those lines around his eyes? When had his hairline started receding just slightly at the temples? When had he stopped being the boy who used to call me Dad and started being this stranger who went by Mike? The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't some mistake where the invitation got lost in the mail or an oversight where someone forgot to call me. This was intentional, deliberate. My son had made a conscious choice to get married without me there. I sat in my empty house, the same house where I'd raised him, where he'd taken his first steps in the living room and learned to read at the kitchen table. And I understood that somewhere along the way, I had become a stranger to my own child. The photos were still there on the screen, hundreds of them, documenting a day that should have been one of the happiest of my life. Instead, they were evidence of how completely I'd been cut out of his world. I could see in his face that he wasn't thinking about me at all. He wasn't sad that I wasn't there. He wasn't missing me. He was relieved. That's what hurt the most. Not that I'd missed his wedding, but that my absence had made his day better. That his happiness was somehow dependent on my not being there to witness it. I closed the laptop, but the images were burned into my memory. My son, smiling wider than I'd seen him smile in years, surrounded by everyone except the man who'd loved him first and longest. The man who'd changed his diapers and taught him to throw a baseball and sat up all night when he had pneumonia at age 7. The man who apparently was no longer welcome in his life. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those wedding photos. Michael in his tuxedo, looking so confident and grown up. Sarah in her white dress, beautiful and radiant. All those familiar faces celebrating without me. So I did what any father would do when his world suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. I tried to figure out where it all went wrong. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, mentally rewinding through the last few years like an old VHS tape, looking for the moment when everything changed. When did my son stop wanting me in his life? The visits had become less frequent, that was true. Used to be, Michael would come by every couple of weeks. We'd watch the game, order pizza, talk about work and life and whatever was on his mind. Simple stuff, father and son time. But gradually those visits stretched out, every thrown. Weeks became once a month. Once a month became every 6 weeks. I'd noticed, of course. How could I not? But I told myself he was busy. He'd gotten that promotion at the accounting firm 2 years ago. More responsibility, longer hours. He was building his career, establishing himself. That's what young men do. That's what I'd done at his age. The phone calls got shorter too. Used to be, we'd talk for an hour on Sunday evenings. He'd tell me about his week. I'd tell him about mine. We'd discuss his apartment, his coworkers, the places he was thinking about traveling to, but those conversations gradually became 20 minutes, then 15, then just long enough for him to check in and make sure I was okay. When did, "How are you doing, Dad?" become code for, "I'm calling because I feel obligated, but I want to get off the phone as soon as possible"? I remembered his last visit about 6 months ago. He'd seemed distracted, kept checking his phone even while we were talking. I'd asked him about it, and he said it was work stuff, some client emergency. But now I wonder if it was her. Sarah. Was she texting him while he was visiting his father? Was she the reason he kept glancing at his watch? The reason he left after only an hour instead of staying for dinner like he used to? Had she already decided I was a problem that needed to be managed? The holidays had felt different too. Last Thanksgiving, Michael came by for maybe 2 hours. He ate quickly, made polite conversation, and left before dessert. Said he had plans with friends. Christmas was the same story. He brought me a gift, a book I'd mentioned wanting to read months earlier. But he seemed eager to leave, like being in his childhood home made him uncomfortable. I'd attributed it to growing up, to him establishing his independence. Sons are supposed to create their own lives, aren't they? I didn't want to be one of those clingy parents who can't let go, who make their adult children feel guilty for having their own friends and interests. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I should have fought harder to stay connected. Maybe I should have demanded more of his time, insisted on meeting his friends, pushed my way into his life instead of respectfully stepping back. But then I think about his mother, my ex-wife, Linda, and I wonder if this was orchestrated from the beginning. Our divorce 15 years ago was bitter, not just because of the usual reasons marriages fall apart, but because Linda made it personal. She blamed me for everything. The financial struggles, the long hours I worked to keep us afloat, the stress that came with trying to build a life for our family. When we split up, she got primary custody of Michael and Sarah, our daughter, and I got every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. I thought we'd worked through all that animosity for the kids' sake. We managed to be civil at graduations and school events. We coordinated holidays without too much drama. Michael never seemed to feel caught in the middle, and I was proud of that. I thought we'd done right by our children despite our personal failures. But now I'm wondering if Linda was playing a longer game, if she spent all those years subtly poisoning my children against me, planting little seeds of doubt and resentment that finally bloomed into complete rejection. Did she tell Michael I wasn't a good father? Did she convince him that my love was somehow inadequate? That my presence in his life was more burden than blessing? Did she frame every attempt I made to stay close as evidence that I was needy or controlling? The self-doubt is the worst part. I keep examining my own behavior, wondering if I pushed too hard, if I called too often, if I gave too much unsolicited advice. Michael used to joke that I had opinions about everything, his job, his apartment, his dating life. But that's what fathers do, isn't it? We care. We want our children to be happy and successful. We share our experience because we love them. When did love become overwhelming? When did caring become too emotional? I pulled out the photo albums that night, the ones I hadn't looked at in years. There we were, Michael at age 5, proud as punch with his first fish, a tiny bluegill we caught at the lake. Michael at 8, gap-toothed and grinning after losing his first baseball game. Michael at 16, rolling his eyes but smiling as I insisted on taking pictures before his junior prom. Michael at 18, walking across the stage at graduation. I was so proud that day. We both were. Linda and I actually hugged afterwards, forgot our differences for just a moment in the face of our shared love for our son. Michael at 22, celebrating his college graduation. That was the last really good day we had together, I think. We went out for dinner, just the two of us, and he thanked me for all the sacrifices I'd made to pay for his education. He seemed genuinely grateful, genuinely happy that I was his father. What happened between that dinner and those wedding photos? What changed in the 8 years since he graduated that made my presence in his life unwelcome? Maybe nothing changed. Maybe I just finally saw the truth I'd been avoiding all along. Maybe Michael had been slowly pulling away for years, and I'd been too desperate to maintain our connection to notice. Maybe what I thought was love, he experienced as pressure. Maybe what I thought was involvement, he felt as intrusion. Or maybe I didn't do anything wrong at all. Maybe this is just what happens when children grow up and start their own families. Maybe some sons simply outgrow their need for their fathers, and there's nothing you can do about it except grieve the relationship you thought you had. That might be the most painful possibility of all. That this isn't about anything I did wrong, but about who I am fundamentally not being enough anymore. 3 days went by without sleeping properly. I'd lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind churning through the same questions over and over. Why wasn't I invited? How long had they been planning this? Did anyone think to ask where Michael's father was? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Sarah, my daughter, not his wife. If anyone would give me straight answers, it would be her. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, sweetheart. I was wondering if we could talk." There was a pause, a telling pause. "About what?" "I think you know about what." Another silence, longer this time. Then a sigh that told me everything I needed to know. "Dad, You knew, didn't you? About the wedding?" "Yes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The confirmation hit me like a slap, even though I'd been expecting it. How long? How long did you know?" "A few months. Dad, I wanted to tell you, but what? But your brother specifically asked you not to?" "It's complicated." I was pacing around my kitchen now, the phone pressed tight against my ear. "Complicated how, Sarah? What's complicated about inviting your father to your wedding?" He said he wanted to keep it small, just immediate family and a few close friends. I am immediate family. I'm his father. I know that. But Sarah, his Sarah, she has strong feelings about what? About me? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I couldn't help it. This woman I'd never met had apparently decided I wasn't welcome at my own son's wedding. My daughter's voice got even quieter. "She thinks you're overwhelming, too emotional. She told Michael that she didn't want any drama at their wedding." Drama. I was potential drama. What drama, Sarah? What have I ever done to create drama? "It's not what you've done exactly. It's the way you love people. You love really intensely, Dad, and that makes some people uncomfortable. Too emotional. Overwhelming." The words echoed in my head like accusations. I thought about all the times I'd called Michael just to check in, all the times I'd offered advice he hadn't asked for, all the times I'd probably pushed too hard to stay connected to his life. So my son chose his fiancée's comfort over having his father at his wedding. Sarah didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was thick with something that might have been pity. Dad, I think he was trying to avoid having to choose at all. I think he thought if he didn't tell you, then he wouldn't have to deal with conflict. Conflict with whom? With her. With Sarah. She made it clear from the beginning that she didn't want you there. I stopped pacing. From the beginning of what? How long have they been together? About 2 years. 2 years. My son had been in a serious relationship for 2 years, serious enough to marry this woman, and I'd never even heard her name. I'd asked him about dating, about whether he was seeing anyone special. He'd always been vague, said he was focusing on work, said he'd let me know when there was someone important to introduce to the family. He's been lying to me for 2 years. Not lying, exactly. More like not sharing. What's the difference, Sarah? She didn't have an answer for that. Did you meet her? Before the wedding? A few times. She's nice, smart. She makes Michael happy. But she doesn't want me in their lives. Another pause. She thinks you're too involved. She told Michael that healthy adults don't talk to their parents every week. Every week. I called my son once a week, usually on Sundays, and that was considered too involved. That made me unhealthy, clingy, emotionally overwhelming. What did Michael say to that? He said he understood, that maybe he needed to set better boundaries. Boundaries. My weekly phone calls tell it. Oh, my son had become boundary violations. My interest in his life had become intrusion. My love had become a problem that needed managing. Sarah, do you think I'm overwhelming? Do you think I'm too emotional? The question hung in the air between us. I could hear my daughter breathing on the other end of the line, choosing her words carefully. Dad, you love us so much. Sometimes I think you love us more than we know how to handle. You've always been all in with everything. Our sports teams, our school events, our problems, our successes. You feel everything so deeply. Is that wrong? No, it's not wrong. But it can be a lot, especially for someone who didn't grow up with that kind of intensity. I thought about Linda, about how she used to tell me I was too much, too passionate about work, too invested in the children's activities, too present in moments when she wanted space. I thought that was her issue, her inability to handle genuine emotion and engagement. Now I was wondering if maybe it was mine. Do you talk to Michael regularly? I asked. Not really, maybe once a month, sometimes less. Once a month. My daughter, who I'd raised with the same love and intensity, had naturally settled into a once-a-month relationship with me. She'd never made it feel like a rejection, never made me feel unwelcome, but she'd still created distance. Maybe the problem wasn't Michael's new wife. Maybe the problem was me, and she just had the courage to name it. Dad, I'm sorry you found out this way. I'm sorry you weren't invited. I know how much it must hurt. It does hurt, but what hurts more is that my son has been living a double life for 2 years. He's been pretending to be someone he isn't when he talks to me, keeping me at arm's length while building a whole new family that doesn't include me. I don't think he meant to hurt you, but he did, and he chose to do it this way rather than having an honest conversation about what he needed from me or what his future wife needed from our relationship. We talked for a few more minutes, but the damage was done. I'd gotten the answers I was looking for, and they were worse than I'd imagined. This wasn't about a miscommunication or a family feud that could be resolved with time and effort. This was about me being fundamentally too much for the people I loved most in the world. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to imagine what my life would look like if I was less emotional, less involved, less present. If I called my children once a month instead of once a week. If I stopped asking about their lives, stopped offering advice, stopped expressing how proud I was of them. Would they love me more if I loved them less intensely? Would I be more welcome in their lives if I needed them less? The questions felt like betraying everything I believed about what it meant to be a father. But maybe that was the point. Maybe my version of fatherhood had become obsolete. Maybe love that demands nothing, expects nothing, and expresses itself quietly was what modern adult children needed. I just didn't know if I knew how to love that way. Days went by. Then a week, then 2 weeks. Michael never returned my calls. I'd crafted a dozen text messages that I never sent. Congratulations on your wedding, son. I wish you and Sarah all the happiness in the world. Delete. Too formal. I saw the photos on Facebook. You looked so happy. Can we talk? Delete. Too needy. I love you, Michael. I hope we can work through this. Delete. Too emotional. The very thing that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. I drove by his apartment building twice during those 2 weeks. Not to confront him. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Just to see if I could spot his car. To confirm that he was still living his normal life while mine had been turned upside down. Both times I sat in my car across the street for maybe 10 minutes before driving home. What was I going to do? Knock on his door and demand an explanation? Force him to have a conversation he clearly didn't want to have? The silence from him was answer enough. This wasn't an oversight that needed correcting. This was a choice that had been made deliberately, carefully, with full knowledge of how much it would hurt me. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. When I had lunch with my friend Tom from work, he spent 20 minutes talking about his daughter's wedding planning, every detail, the venue, the flowers, the dress shopping, the guest list drama. His daughter called him every few days with updates, asked his opinion on everything from the menu to the music. When I played golf with my neighbor Bill, he mentioned that his son was thinking about proposing to his girlfriend. He wants me to go with him to pick out the ring, Bill said. Says he needs his old man's advice about what women like. These conversations used to make me smile, used to make me think about how close I was with my own children. Now they felt like evidence of how far outside the normal range my relationship with Michael had fallen. I realized I'd been existing on the periphery of his life without even recognizing it. While other fathers were integral parts of their adult children's major decisions, I'd been relegated to polite weekly phone calls and obligatory holiday visits. I'd convinced myself we were close because we talked regularly, but talking and actually sharing your life are two different things. When was the last time Michael had asked for my advice about anything meaningful? When was the last time he'd called me with good news he was excited to share? When was the last time our conversations had lasted more than 15 minutes? The loneliness was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I'd been divorced for 15 years, had gotten used to living alone, had built a life that didn't depend on constant companionship. But this was different. This was the particular isolation that comes from being rejected by someone you never imagined could reject you. Other kinds of abandonment make sense in a way. Friends drift apart as their lives go in different directions. Romantic relationships end when people grow incompatible. But parental love is supposed to be different. It's supposed to be unbreakable, unconditional, permanent. The idea that a child could simply decide they don't want their parent in their life challenges everything I thought I understood about how families work. I kept thinking about all the sacrifices I'd made for Michael over the years. The overtime shifts I'd worked to pay for his college, the vacations I'd skipped to afford his baseball equipment, the nights I'd spent helping him with homework, driving him to practices, sitting through school events that bored me to tears because being there mattered to him. Now those memories felt foolish, like I'd been loving someone who was never really there, like I'd been pouring my heart into a relationship that existed more in my mind than in reality. I started having dreams about him. Not the wedding. I'd forced myself to stop looking at those photos after the first week, but older memories. Teaching him to ride a bike in our driveway, taking him to his first baseball game, the night he came home crying because some kid at school had called him names, and I held him until he felt better. In the dreams, he was always young, always my little boy who needed his dad. I'd wake up and for just a moment I'd forget about the wedding, forget about the rejection. Then reality would crash back, and I'd remember that the child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms had grown into a man who couldn't even be bothered to return my phone calls. Grief, I was learning, isn't just for death. It's for the death of relationships you thought were permanent. It's for the loss of a version of someone you loved who apparently never existed in the first place. It's for the future you'd imagined that suddenly became impossible. I'd always pictured myself walking Michael down the aisle someday. Even though that's traditionally the bride's father's job, I'd imagined some version of it, some way to be meaningfully part of his wedding day. I'd imagined giving a speech at his reception, sharing stories about what a wonderful man he'd grown up to be. I'd imagined dancing with his new wife, welcoming her into our family. I'd imagined holding my grandchildren someday, teaching them the same things I'd taught their father. I'd imagined family holidays where 3 generations would gather around my table, sharing food and stories and the comfortable intimacy of people who've known each other forever. All of those futures evaporated in the space between seeing those wedding photos and realizing I wasn't included in them. Not just the wedding itself, but everything that comes after. If I wasn't welcome at his wedding, why would I be welcome at baby showers or birthday parties or any of the celebrations that mark a family's life together? I was grieving not just for what I'd lost, but for what I'd never have. And the hardest part was that Michael didn't seem to be grieving at all. His silence suggested that my absence from his life felt natural to him, maybe even relieving. That's what I couldn't get past. Not that he'd chosen to exclude me from his wedding, but that he'd done it so easily, without apparent conflict or regret, without even the courtesy of an explanation. I was learning that there are different kinds of love, and that the kind I'd always given, intense, involved, unconditional, wasn't necessarily the kind that adult children want from their parents. Maybe what I thought was devotion, they experienced as pressure. Maybe what I thought was closeness, they felt as intrusion. But I didn't know how to love any other way, and I wasn't sure I wanted to learn. 3 weeks after discovering the wedding photos, I found myself talking to Michael when he wasn't there. It started by accident. I was making dinner. Just a simple pasta dish, nothing fancy. And I caught myself saying out loud, "You remember how you used to love this sauce, don't you?" As if he was sitting at the kitchen table like he used to, telling me about his day while I cooked. The sound of my own voice in the empty house startled me, but once I'd started, I couldn't seem to stop. "When did I become someone you had to hide from?" I asked the empty chair where he used to sit. "When did calling you once a week become too much? When did caring about your life become overwhelming?" The questions I couldn't ask him in person came pouring out to the silence. All the hurt and confusion and desperate need for understanding that I'd been carrying around like a weight in my chest. "What did I do wrong, Michael? Was it the advice? Did I push too hard when you were job hunting? Did I call too often when you were stressed about that promotion?" I started keeping a journal, something I'd never done in my life. At first it was just a way to organize my thoughts, to make sense of the chaos in my head, but it quickly became something else. Letters to my son that I'd never send, conversations with him that we'd never have. "Do you remember the night you called me crying because Jessica broke up with you?" I wrote one evening. "You were 24, living in that terrible apartment with the leaky ceiling, convinced you'd never find anyone who could love you. I drove over at midnight with ice cream, and we stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about heartbreak and resilience and how sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone leave so the right person can find you. You told me that night that you hoped you'd be half the man I was when you grew up. You said I was your hero. When did that change? When did the father you looked up to become the father you wanted to escape from?" Writing these letters helped me see patterns I'd missed when I was living through them. How my attempts to stay connected might have felt like monitoring. How my eagerness to help might have seemed like I didn't trust his ability to handle his own problems. When he'd started his new job, I'd called every few days to see how it was going. I thought I was being supportive, but maybe it felt like surveillance. Maybe it sent the message that I didn't believe he could succeed without my constant check-ins. When he'd been apartment hunting, I'd researched neighborhoods and sent him listings I thought he might like. I thought I was being helpful. But maybe it felt like I was trying to control where he lived. Maybe it suggested I didn't trust his judgment. When he'd started dating seriously, I'd asked questions about the women he was seeing. Not invasive questions. At least I didn't think they were invasive. Just normal father questions. "Are you happy? Is she good to you? Do you think it's serious?" But maybe what felt like caring to me felt like prying to him. Maybe my interest in his romantic life crossed boundaries I didn't even know existed. "I need you to help me understand," I wrote one night. "I need you to tell me where the line is between loving you and smothering you, because apparently I've been crossing it for years without realizing it." The hardest letters to write were the ones where I tried to imagine his perspective, what it might have felt like to have a father who called every week with questions about your life, who remembered details about your work projects and asked for updates, who wanted to be included in every major decision. "Maybe having a father who cared so much felt like pressure," I wrote. "Maybe you felt like you had to be perfect because I was always so proud of you. Maybe my love felt like expectations you couldn't meet. But even as I wrote those words, part of me rebelled against them. What was wrong with a father who called regularly? What was wrong with being interested in your child's life? What was wrong with expressing pride and love and support? I keep wondering if this is about me or about the world changing, I wrote. Maybe fathers aren't supposed to be deeply involved in their adult children's lives anymore. Maybe modern independence means cutting emotional ties, not just financial ones. Maybe what our generation saw as normal family closeness, your generation sees as unhealthy attachment. Some nights I'd write angry letters where I let myself feel the full force of my rage at being discarded so casually. You could have talked to me, I wrote one particularly difficult evening. You could have said, Dad, I need more space. Or, Dad, Sarah finds our relationship uncomfortable. You could have given me a chance to adjust, to change, to find a way to love you that didn't feel overwhelming to either of you. Instead, you chose the coward's way out. You chose to simply exclude me rather than dealing with the discomfort of an honest conversation. You robbed me of the chance to be different, better, less whatever it is about me that you can't handle. But I always ended up back at the same place, missing him, missing the relationship I thought we had, missing the future I thought we'd share, missing the son who used to need his father. I just want to understand, I wrote the night I finally put the journal away. I want to know if there's a way back from this, or if I need to accept that this is just who we are now. A father and son who love each other from a distance so great, we might as well be strangers. The conversations with ghosts didn't give me the answers I was looking for, but they did something else. They helped me realize that I'd been having a relationship with my idea of Michael, rather than with Michael himself. The son I'd been trying so hard to stay close to had apparently been pulling away for years. I just hadn't wanted to see it. 3 weeks and 2 days after I discovered the wedding photos, Michael finally texted me. I know you saw the photos. We needed to keep it small and simple. No apology. No explanation of why I hadn't been told beforehand. No acknowledgement of how devastating it must have been for me to find out about my son's wedding through Facebook. Just a brief, impersonal explanation that treated me like I was a distant acquaintance who might have felt slighted about not being invited to a casual dinner party. I stared at the message for probably 20 minutes before responding. I wrote and deleted a dozen different replies. Everything from, how could you do this to me, to congratulations, I hope you're happy. In the end, I settled on something I hoped struck a balance between expressing my hurt and maintaining my dignity. I'm happy that you're happy, Michael. I wish I could have been there to celebrate with you. I love you and hope we can talk soon. His response came 3 hours later, just 4 words. I need some space. Space. Not, I need time to figure out how to explain this to you. Not, I need to have a conversation with Sarah about how to include you in our life. Just space, distance, less of me, not more understanding between us. I set the phone down and tried to process what I was feeling. Relief that he'd finally acknowledged what had happened. Disappointment that his acknowledgement was so cold and dismissive. Hurt that his first communication with me after getting married was essentially telling me to back off even further. But mostly, I felt the terrible weight of unconditional parental love when that love isn't reciprocated. This is the impossible position every parent eventually faces, I think. You love your children without conditions, without reservations, without the ability to turn that love off even when it's not wanted. They become adults with the right to make their own choices about who they want in their lives, even if those choices break your heart. What are you supposed to do when your unconditional love becomes a burden to the person you're loving? I thought about my options. I could keep calling, keep texting, keep pushing for the relationship I wanted us to have. I could show up at his apartment, demand a face-to-face conversation, refuse to be dismissed so easily. I could make myself impossible to ignore. But what would that accomplish, besides proving that his new wife was right about me being overwhelming and too emotional? I could step back entirely, stop calling, stop texting, stop trying to maintain a connection that clearly wasn't wanted. I could give him all the space he was asking for, and more. I could let him live his life without any input or involvement from me. But that felt like giving up on the most important relationship of my life without a fight. Or I could try to find some middle ground, some way to love him that didn't feel suffocating to him, some way to stay connected without being intrusive. But I didn't know what that looked like. How do you love someone less intensely when tie is the only way you know how to love? I realized I was grieving not just for my relationship with Michael, but for a version of fatherhood that apparently no longer existed. The kind of fatherhood where you stayed deeply involved in your children's lives forever, where they called you for advice and included you in their major decisions and wanted you at their important events. Maybe that kind of fatherhood had never really existed, except in my imagination. Maybe I'd confused being needed with being loved, and now that Michael didn't need me anymore, I was discovering that the love wasn't as strong as I'd thought. Or maybe the love was still there, but it had become incompatible with the person he was trying to become. Maybe loving me felt like staying tethered to a version of himself that he'd outgrown. Maybe my presence in his life reminded him of being dependent, and independence meant cutting those emotional ties. I tried to imagine what it would feel like to be married to someone who found my family relationships problematic. If Linda, back when we were married, had told me that my father was too involved in our lives, that his weekly phone calls were inappropriate, that his interest in our marriage was boundary crossing, what would I have done? Probably exactly what Michael had done. I would have chosen my wife's comfort over my father's feelings, especially if I was already feeling like my family relationships were more complicated than I wanted them to be. That was the most painful realization of all. This wasn't necessarily about Michael not loving me. It might have been about him loving his wife more, and being forced to choose between our comfort and hers. But understanding why he'd made the choice he'd made didn't make it hurt any less. I looked at his text message again. I need some space. Not, we need some space, or this situation requires some pace. He needed it, from me. My presence in his life, even the minimal presence of weekly phone calls and occasional visits, was something he experienced as pressure that needed relief. How do you respond to that? How do you love someone who experiences your love as burden? I didn't text him back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. Not because I was punishing him, but because I was trying to learn how to love him in a way that didn't require anything from him in return. Love without expectation of reciprocation. Love without need for acknowledgement or appreciation. It was the hardest thing I'd ever tried to do, and I wasn't sure it was even possible. The months that followed were the loneliest of my life. I stopped calling Michael every week. Stopped texting him about things I thought he might find interesting, stopped sending him articles about his industry, or asking how work was going. It felt like holding my breath, like fighting against every instinct I had as his father. Every Sunday evening, I'd sit in my kitchen with my phone in my hand, muscle memory telling me it was time to call my son. But I'd remember his text, "I need some space," and I'd put the phone away. Week after week, fighting the urge to reach out. It wasn't easy. Every cell in my body wanted to fight for him, to prove my worth as a father, to fix whatever had gone wrong between us. But I was finally starting to understand that you can't love someone back into your life. You can't force a relationship that the other person doesn't want to have. The hardest part was admitting that maybe I'd never had the relationship with Michael that I thought I had. Maybe I'd been so focused on being needed by him that I'd never stopped to consider whether he actually wanted me to need him back. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to Michael's wife, just an unfortunate coincidence that made every appointment feel like a reminder of what I'd lost. At 62 years old, sitting in a therapist's office felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that I couldn't handle my own problems anymore. "Tell me about your relationship with your son," she said during our first session. "I don't think I have one anymore," I replied. "What did you have before?" That was a harder question to answer than it should have been. What had we had? Regular phone calls where I asked questions and he gave brief answers. Visits where I tried to extend the time and he seemed eager to leave. Holidays where we went through the motions of family closeness without the actual intimacy. "I thought we were close," I said finally. "I thought he valued our relationship as much as I did." "What made you think that?" He never told me otherwise. He kept taking my calls, kept visiting, kept including me in his life. I thought that meant he wanted me there. Is it possible he was doing those things out of obligation rather than desire? The question hit me like a physical blow, but I knew she was right. How many of Michael's interactions with me had been motivated by duty rather than genuine affection? How long had he been going through the motions of being a loving son while actually wishing I'd just leave him alone? I built my whole identity around being needed by my children. I admitted during one session. When Linda and I got divorced, I told myself that at least I'd always have Michael and Sarah. They'd always need their father. But now they don't need me, and I don't know who I am if I'm not someone's dad. What were you before you became a father? Another difficult question. I'd gotten married young, had children relatively early. My adult life had been defined by providing for and caring for my family. Work was just something I did to support my role as husband and father. I'm not sure I remember, I said. That became the focus of our work together, not trying to fix my relationship with Michael. Dr. Chen was clear that I couldn't control or change another person's choices, but figuring out who I was when I wasn't defined by my role as an actively needed parent. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. I started doing things I'd put aside when I became consumed with maintaining my connection to my adult children. I joined a hiking group for people over 50. I started volunteering at a literacy program, teaching adults to read. I took up photography, something I'd been interested in as a young man but had never had time to pursue seriously. Slowly, I began to build a life that didn't depend on my children's approval or presence for meaning. It wasn't that I stopped loving them. I don't think that's possible. But I stopped needing them to love me back in order to feel worthwhile. The work was hard. There were setbacks. Days when I'd catch myself starting to call Michael before remembering that he'd asked for space. Evenings when I'd see something that reminded me of him and feel the full weight of his absence all over again. But gradually, I started to understand something important. Loving someone doesn't require them to love you back. Being a good father doesn't depend on your children acknowledging your goodness. You can be proud of the parent you were without needing validation from the people you parented. I'd given Michael everything I had to give as a father. I'd loved him unconditionally, supported him through difficulties, celebrated his successes, and tried my best to guide him toward happiness. The fact that he no longer wanted or needed that kind of intensive parental involvement didn't negate the value of what I'd given him. Maybe my job as his father was complete. Maybe raising him to be independent and self-sufficient meant accepting that he no longer needed me to be actively involved in his daily life. Maybe successful parenting ultimately leads to this kind of separation, and my mistake had been in not recognizing that. It took me 8 months to reach a place where I could think about Michael without feeling that crushing sense of loss and rejection. 8 months to understand that his need for space wasn't necessarily a reflection of my failures as a father, but might simply be his way of establishing himself as an adult. I still missed him. I still wondered about his life, still hoped he was happy, still loved him with the same intensity I always had, but I'd learned to love him without requiring anything from him in return. It was the most difficult lesson I'd ever had to learn, but maybe the most important one too. It's been 1.5 years now since I found out about Michael's wedding through Facebook. 1 year since his text asking for space. 14 months since I stopped calling him every week. I won't lie and say it doesn't still hurt. There are moments, when I see a father and son together at a restaurant, when I hear my friends talking about their adult children's lives, when I pass by that little league field where I used to watch Michael play, when the loss feels fresh all over again. But I've learned to live with that pain instead of being consumed by it. Michael sends me brief updates now and then, a text when he got promoted at work, a photo of their new apartment when they moved across town, a message on my birthday that said, "Happy birthday, Dad. Hope you're well." I respond to each one with genuine warmth, but I don't push for more. I don't ask follow-up questions or try to turn his brief communications into longer conversations. I've learned to accept whatever level of relationship he's comfortable with, even if it's less than what I'd prefer. "Thank you for letting me know," I write back. "I'm proud of you." Or, "The apartment looks great. I hope you're both very happy there." Simple responses that acknowledge his gesture without demanding more from him. It's not the relationship I dreamed of having with my adult son, but it's something. And maybe something is enough. I've built a fuller life for myself, one that doesn't depend on my children's approval or presence for meaning. The hiking group I joined has become a source of real friendship. We take weekend trips to state parks, explore trails I never would have discovered on my own. There's something healing about being outdoors, about physical challenge that requires your complete attention and leaves no room for brooding. The literacy program has been deeply rewarding too. Helping adults learn to read has shown me that there are many ways to be needed, many ways to make a meaningful difference in someone's life. My student Maria, a 60-year-old grandmother who never had the chance to learn as a child, cried when she read her first complete book last month. That moment of triumph reminded me that impact doesn't always come from the relationships we expect it to. Photography has given me a new way to see the world. I'm drawn to pictures of ordinary moments. An elderly couple sharing a bench in the park, children playing in their front yard, people going about their daily lives unaware that they're being observed. There's beauty in the mundane that I never noticed when I was so focused on my own family drama. When people ask about my children now, I speak about them with quiet pride, but without the desperate need to prove our closeness that once consumed me. Michael's doing well, I say. He's married now, living across town. Sarah calls me once a month or so. They're both building good lives for themselves. I don't elaborate. I don't share details about their careers or their relationships or their plans for the future, because honestly, I don't know most of those details anymore. But I don't present that as a problem that needs solving. It's just the way things are. The hardest earned wisdom I've gained is this. Some relationships can't be saved, only grieved. You can't love someone back into your life if they've decided they don't want to be there. The best thing you can do sometimes is love them from a distance and focus on building a life that brings you joy and purpose independent of their choices. I understand now that there are different seasons of parenthood. The season of daily caregiving and constant involvement. The season of guidance and support during the transition to adulthood. And then this season, the season of loving from afar, of being available without being intrusive, of accepting that your children's happiness doesn't require your presence. I've learned that being a good father sometimes means accepting when your child chooses to walk away. It means loving them enough to let them go, even when letting go breaks your heart. Last week I looked at those wedding photos again for the first time in months. Michael looked so happy, so confident, so genuinely joyful. Sarah, his Sarah, was radiant beside him. The love between them was obvious, even in a photograph. I felt sadness looking at those pictures, but not the devastating grief that once overwhelmed me. Instead, I felt something closer to peace. My son had found happiness. He'd built a life that brought him joy. The fact that this life didn't include me in the way I'd hoped didn't diminish its value or his right to create it. Maybe that's what unconditional love really means, not loving someone in hopes that they'll love you back the same way, but loving them enough to want their happiness even when that happiness doesn't require your participation. I still hope that someday Michael and I will find our way back to each other, that we'll figure out how to have a relationship that works for both of us. I hope I'll meet his wife properly, that I'll be welcomed into their lives in whatever capacity feels comfortable for them. But if that never happens, I've finally learned to be okay with that too. I was a good father to him when he needed a father. I loved him completely, supported him fully, and helped him become the man he is today. The fact that he no longer needs or wants that kind of intensive parental involvement doesn't erase the value of what I gave him. I've learned the difference between loving someone and needing them to love you back. I've discovered that a meaningful life doesn't require validation from the people you love most. And I've found that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to choose their own relationship with you, even if their choice isn't what you would prefer. It took losing my son to learn how to love him properly. I just wish I'd learned it sooner, when there might have been time to save what we had. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some lessons can only be learned through loss. Maybe the wisdom that comes from surviving heartbreak is worth something, even if it comes too late to change the situation that broke your heart. I'm a different man than I was 18 months ago. Quieter, more self-contained, less desperate for connection. I've learned to find meaning in my own life instead of living through my children's achievements. I've discovered that there are many ways to matter in this world, and being needed by your adult children is only one of them. I miss the father I used to be sometimes. The man who called his son every week and believed that love could overcome any obstacle. But I respect the man I've become more, the man who loves without expectation, who gives without requiring gratitude, who has learned to be whole on his own. Michael is happy, despite everything. That still matters to me more than my own hurt feelings. And maybe that's the final lesson in all of this, that real love isn't about getting what you need from someone, but about wanting what's best for them, even when what's best for them doesn't include you. I've finally learned how to love my son the way he needs to be loved, from a distance, without pressure, without conditions. I just wish it hadn't taken losing him to figure that out.